Hey, Katie, how's it going?
Hi, Scott. It's going good. Glad to be here.
Glad to have you here and glad to dive in this convergence of neuroscience and contemplative practices like meditation. I think 10 years ago, this was probably something that not a lot of people thought about. They were just trying to be less stressed assholes like myself. And now we're kind of at this point in our human journey where people are looking around and it's almost like you feel bad if you don't have a meditative practice.
Yeah.
And and there's lots of people that experience the benefits and want some type of explanation as to, well, what is actually happening here that we can prove using the available tools that we have.
Yeah.
And so what an exciting place to be. And maybe to kick things off, just start off with maybe just telling people a little bit about yourself and the work that you're doing.
Sure. So, yeah, I've dedicated my life to trying to understand this stuff. And when I was a sophomore in college, I was studying chemistry. And then through a convergence of some psychedelic experiences and going on a 10-day silent meditation retreat, I came back from that retreat and switched my major into neuroscience because I wanted to understand what was going on with these transient states of consciousness that felt like glimpses into another better world. And my thinking was, well, these states have to have correlates in the brain. And much like kind of a kid taking apart a VCR to figure out how it works, I figured, well, if I can understand how this works in the brain, I can understand these states of consciousness and understand how we get from here, this sort of default everyday consciousness, into these much more interesting, deeper well-being, more connected states. So I've been doing this for a long time. And I think it's funny you mentioned, when I first started meditating, I wouldn't tell my neuroscience colleagues that I had a meditation
Oh, yeah.
practice because it felt too weird. And slowly over time, I was able to bring the worlds more and more together. But when I first started doing meditation research, I would still have to explain to people what meditation is. Like people would be like, oh, that thing the Beatles did. And that was like a good way for me to explain it. And now, when I tell people I study meditation or I'm involved in meditation, almost every single person says, oh, I know I should be doing that. And so it's been
Totally.
a huge change over the last decade in the sort of popular adoption of these practices. And I think it's moving in a really good direction and indicating that people are looking for something deeper, looking for deeper sense of well-being, more connectedness, more psychological health. And this is one way to find it.
That's amazing. And you're doing your research at University of California, is that correct?
Yeah, so I did my postdoc at Harvard Med School, and I did my thesis at Boston University looking at how meditation affects the way that people pay attention. And now I'm doing research in the Center for the Science of Psychedelics at UC Berkeley. And then I'm also one of the founders of the Berkeley Alembic, which is a nonprofit in South Berkeley. And we run a bunch of meditation and movement, psychedelic preparation, integration classes. And we're setting up a nonprofit neuroscience lab in the space to be able to study some of the more kind of like out there states of consciousness that you can get to in meditation.
That's really cool. And that's really interesting. And so is just out of personal curiosity, is it easier to do that outside of a university setting?
It is.
Is
It
that
is
is that
these
the
days.
impetus?
Yeah. So inside of the kind of academic system as it is, first of all, when I first started studying meditation back in 2011, I only mentioned meditation in my grant proposal once. Everywhere else in the grant proposal, I talked about attention training and methods for attention training. So it was sort of shrouded in this
Mm,
attentional lens. Um, and right now, scientific funding inside of academia mostly comes from governmental sources and is very aimed at curing diseases helping people, which makes total sense. So if you're in the academic system, the kind of default things that get funded are like, oh, let's look at the effect of a short meditation intervention on anxiety. And we'll do sort of an anxiety metric. And then we'll do 2 weeks of meditation training for people who've never meditated before. And then we'll do the same anxiety metric and we'll see what changed. And that's very useful. And it's helping a lot of people a little bit. There's a separate kind of arena of knowledge in the deep practitioner community. And this is where you get phenomena, and I can explain these if you don't know what they are, but this is where you get phenomena like the jhanas, and you get Nirodha and cessations, and you get these experiences that are really out there in terms of like gymnastics tricks that the brain can do that just aren't really known to academic science yet. And so what I hope to be able to do at Alembic, since we're a nonprofit, we're mostly philanthropically funded, is be able to use some of that philanthropic funding to study things that are kind of outside the Overton window of academic science. And in so doing, be able to kind of bring these more out there states of consciousness into the discussion inside academia so we can start studying things. Yeah.
You know, it's interesting, and not to minimize the research, but it's kind of like the focus is on the lowest common denominator and versus the most expansive states of consciousness.
Yeah. And yeah, in a way, it's like the priorities of different funding agencies are just different, you know, and someone's got to cure the diseases and like that's really valuable work. And I just find myself in a very interesting position where I happen to be very deep in both of these different communities, in the practitioner community and in the academic community. And so I think of myself kind of as a translator between these two worlds. Yeah.
Amazing. Amazing. So maybe as background, I mean, what is the latest of what we know that happens from a neuroscience perspective with the most progressive research on meditation?
Sure. So we're looking for different like biomarkers of meditation practice, right? And one of the things that exists right now is a lot of the studies, particularly of people who have a very deep practice, are cross-sectional, not longitudinal. So what that means is that, so you know what that means. So you have like a group of deep practitioners, you have a matched control group, and they're matched on like age and hopefully lifestyle factors, but it's hard. Like a lot of meditators are vegetarians and they get really good sleep, and like you can't.
It comes with a whole package.
The whole life, yeah, exactly. But you do the best you can, and then you sort of look across the groups. But the issue with that is, you know, if you go back to the beginning and someone just sits a 10-day retreat and they have a great time and they decide to keep going versus someone goes and sits a 10-day retreat and they leave on day 2 and they never come back, those brains could be different to start out with. So with cross-sectional stuff, I just want to put this in as a caveat up front, is we don't know if all the way at the beginning, you know, the brains were already different, or if we're seeing differences that happen because of meditation. So that's like a big frontier, is more longitudinal studies where we take a group of people, split them in half, and get half to meditate and leave half alone. But a lot of the interesting things that happen in meditating brains happen after a couple of years. So it's going to be a long, long study, right? So, okay, that aside, what we do see that's very interesting is there's a part of the brain, it's a network of areas called the default mode network. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
Cool. Okay, so the default mode network is sometimes called like the operating system for a self, right? And it's named the default mode network because when you don't give people anything to do, they default to activating this network. And it comes online when you're reflecting on the past or projecting into the future. And interestingly, the default mode network is not very well connected with the rest of the brain. So it's kind of like in a room by itself, talking to itself. And it's in a relationship that you can sort of think of as competitive with the parts of the brain that process the world. So when you have attention networks that are active and you're sort of like looking out into the world, the default mode network gets quieter. And then when you're thinking about your own experience, the default mode network gets louder and the other parts of the brain that process the world get quieter. And we know a couple of interesting things that happen with this relationship in meditation. First of all, and this is work out of NYU that David Heeger and Zoran Josipovic did. When you do focused attention meditation, those networks stay separate. But when you do non-dual meditation, they come into correlation with one another. And then when you've been meditating for a long time, and this is something that my thesis work showed, the ratio of activity in the default mode network and attention networks is the difference is bigger all the time in meditators than it is in non-meditators. So when you're supposed to be paying attention and you've meditated a lot, you stay in attention networks in the brain and you deactivate the default mode network. Whereas if you haven't meditated a lot, the non-meditators are doing this. They're sort of trying to pay attention, but they're getting interrupted by the default mode network all the time. And so it brings that ratio closer together. And that difference between kind of baseline level of activity in the default mode network versus attention networks predicts all sorts of things. It predicts healthy aging. It predicts good emotional regulation. So there are all sorts of positive life outcomes that are associated with this difference between attention network and default mode network. And again, importantly, we don't know if the meditators started out that way in the first place. So we got to find that out. But if meditation is actually changing that, then that's a really useful metric, like a bio signal that we can use to assess how someone's practice is going.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, that's one of the fascinating things about meditation is today. I mean, I have talked to many people and the constant thing that comes up when you're getting started is, I don't know if I'm doing it right. And I also have had one of the other things I think is challenging about it is for me, I remember the first time that I experienced complete awareness, blank mind for a long stretch of time in my waking, moving through the world. And it was kind of like this, holy shit, there's no thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And that had been 7-8 years after I had started meditating. And the question that I ended up coming to me was like, well, was this like some sudden unlock, or has there been some progressive slight change in experience that had just gone unnoticed for such a long period of time? And because the change was so gradual, it was impossible to notice.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so like, the idea that we would be able to have some mechanism to measure these things that is a little bit more objective than our subjective experience is very compelling.
Yeah, it's still very early days. So we have this one metric. I think we'll look back on this in 10 years and have profound humor at how much we didn't know now that we'll know then. This is like the one metric we have. But I think there are going to be a lot more of them. And one of the big questions, in addition to am I doing it right, that people have a lot is, do all these different there are so many different meditation techniques. Mm-hmm. Do they converge? Are they different paths up the same mountain? Or by choosing a technique, are you actually choosing your mountain that you're going to climb, and you're going to end up in different places with different ones? And we don't know the answer to that yet. In the early Buddhist model, in Theravada model, there is this sort of like punctuated equilibrium model of enlightenment, where you have the 4-path model of enlightenment. And each one of those paths is like a one-way turnstile that something flips and you never come back from that. And then in later models, in sort of more fruitional views, it's like you're already always awake and you just have to realize that. And what is going on in those different traditions? Are people sort of using different words to describe a shift in the brain that's the same underneath? Or by sort of starting down one of these paths, are you starting to train yourself in a way that is going to have a different outcome, like biologically? And we just don't know the
Mm.
answer to that yet. It's a really interesting area for study.
Do you have a personal hypothesis on that?
I'm not sure, but one of the things that I want to look at. So, we have Alembic now, and the next step for me is to have a retreat center that has a research center at it, so that we can have an fMRI scanner there and be studying retreat practitioners. Because, like it or not, a lot of the really big changes that happen in meditation, the big changes that happen in experience, often happen on retreat. That's not to say that your daily practice doesn't either prepare you for that or that something interesting can't happen there, but a lot of the stuff happens on retreat. Um, and so one of my kind of dreams is to do the stream entry study and basically get a pre-scan of everyone who's starting a retreat, and then have them sit the retreat, and then talk to the teacher and ask them, okay, who got stream entry on this retreat, and post scan everyone also, so that we can start looking for the kind of pre-post states of this like punctuated equilibrium. My
Can you define stream entry for the audience?
Sure. So I mentioned in early Buddhism, there's four big insights that lead to enlightenment, and you are never the same from one side of these insights to the other side. And so the first insight that you have, that moment, is called stream entry. And from a philosophical perspective, there's an unbroken, stream of teachings and of beings that are moving towards awakening. And by entering that stream, you are now going to be carried forward to enlightenment. There's some
Mm.
reincarnation stuff in there, but it's like, it will happen. You have now put yourself in the stream.
Right,
The
right.
stream
There's
has
no going. There's no
There's
going
no
back.
going back. Yeah, exactly. And there's this great saying, better not to start, but once you start, better to finish. and
Don't I know it? Jesus Christ.
and so in this model, like once you're past that one-way door of stream entry, you are being carried along. And you still have to practice, but you are going to reach enlightenment. I think it's in the next 2 or 3 lifetimes. And then there's a once returner, a non-returner, and an arahat. Those are the next 3 insights. Stream entry is generally associated with an insight into into your own nature, that it's, once you see it, you can't kind of unsee it. And it's like this one-way flip. I think, just to sort of like zoom out for a second to the other question, I think what's happening, this is my hypothesis, is as you move along these different paths, I think these different brain networks that are normally segregated from one another start coming into communication with one another. And I saw some, like, there's a phrase called anecdata. One story is not data, but in a couple of my subjects from my PhD work, there were areas of the default mode network that had no business being in correlation with areas of different attentional networks, but they were. And again, it wasn't a strong enough effect to publish in the paper. It was just a couple of subjects. But I think what might be happening, when people say things like they had a non-dual experience and they say like, I became one with everything, I think what they're talking about there is the default mode network wiring up with the parts of the brain that normally do sensory perception of the world. And so you are getting kind of processed as yet another piece of information in the sensorium, like no different from that tree over there, or this flower, or this thought, or this memory. Like all of it is just, I mean, there's so many different ways to say it. One is just data in the sensorium, and another is like the, divine expression writing on its own canvas, and you can pick where you want to be on that spectrum. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, I'm fascinated to I've had guests on the show like Mark Gober, who wrote a book called Upside Down Thinking, effectively talking about how consciousness is kind of exists outside of the brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and points to lots of kind of like near-death experiences and different phenomena that, basically show an awareness that exists in a dead body,
Yeah.
or someone that's not alive, and uses that as kind of anecdata to make such a claim. And so, yeah, what I'm really fascinated is like, are there states of consciousness where the you don't actually see some type of expression in the brain that is differentiated in any way, yet the experience is so different? Um,
Yes. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is we're limited by the resolution of our tools always. So, I just was part of a team that published this paper on a meditative phenomenon called Nirodha. And this is a very interesting state of consciousness that's basically a content-free state of consciousness. Um, and if you learn it,
can you describe it? Because I read the piece on this and think it's a very interesting
yeah,
study that you guys did.
yeah. So I'll give you a sort of medium length explanation. So I'm not going to go super short, but I won't talk about it for like 17 hours, which I could also do. So uh, I will begin by describing the jhanas. So there are these 8 distinct states of consciousness called the jhanas. And they predate, they're a big thing in Buddhist meditation, but they predate Buddhism. And you also see some Christian mystics describing them. So the jhanas appear to be something kind of fundamental about the brain that the brain can do. Um, there's 8 of them, but then there's a state that's nicknamed the 9th jhana, and this state is called Nirodha Samāpatti, and it's a complete cessation of consciousness. There are 2 different types of cessations. There's the Nirodha type, which depending on your intention, can last minutes up to days. I think there's accounts of it lasting for weeks, but I don't think anyone alive right now can do that. I could be wrong about that. Then there's another type of cessation, which is transient. It's like someone sort of chopped a couple of frames out of a movie. So you're sort of like having experience, and then there's this blip where something's missing, and then you're having experience again. And often the first couple of those that you have are life-changing. So those are the 2 types of cessation. And the phenomenology of it is very interesting because it's a there's no experience. So the experiencer
Can't even, yeah.
is gone and the experience is gone. So you can sort of describe like what it's like to go into and what it's like to come out of. But being in a cessation is like there's sort of nothing about it because there's nothing there.
Yet the physical body is still maintaining breathing. It's still vital signs, all of that.
Exactly. Yeah. And there haven't been too many like long-term studies of people in Nirodha for a long time, but we're hoping to change that. So with the paper we just published, we outlined basically a research program for here's how we could study this thing. And one of the reasons it hasn't been well studied is that, as you may imagine, people who can actually do this stuff are pretty rare. You really have to you have to put in some serious retreat hours to be able to do this. And then once you can do it, it's not like, oh, you can just do it forever. Most people have to actually go back on retreat and ramp up again to be able to do it again. So I have some fMRI data of very advanced practitioners having the more transient type of cessation in the scanner. And amusingly, I was trying to study the jhanas. I told these people don't have any cessations in there, and one of them had 12 anyway. So I've got the data sort of by accident. But the thing with fMRI is that our time resolution is long. So I got the time resolution as high as I could on this study, but it's still 680 milliseconds. And that's a long time in brain time, whereas these transient cessations are very fast. For the longer Nirodha stuff, so far we only have EEG data, and some of that's in the paper. And we see some changes in the alpha frequency in the brain, which is the sort of alpha is an attentional signal, and it puts things together. So, right. So this cup, you know, someone's about to say something interesting when they pick up a cup. Always. So this cup, it has a shape, right, and it has color, and it has this pattern on it, and these lines have a particular orientation. All of those different properties are processed in completely different places of the visual processing hierarchy. It's like, you know, this is in Kansas, and this the shape is in Kansas, and the color is in California, and yet somehow we perceive this as a holistic, as one object. And that's alpha. Alpha binds all of that together so that we can sort of like clump things together and make sense of the world. And we see in Nirodha, the alpha rhythm becomes much less organized. So there's a suggestion there that perception is kind of decoalescing, decohering. So that's very interesting. But there's much more to be done in that direction. And so our limits are the resolution of our tools, the sophistication of the questions that we can ask, and the strength of our experimental design. And those will always kind of track with our practice, or at least speaking personally for me, I can kind of tell where my practice is by the kind of scientific questions that I'm trying to ask.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like your level of sophistication and inquiry is congruent with the depth of experience.
Yeah, and you can't answer a scientific question that you can't think of. So
Mm.
this is why the scientific community is great, is we're all kind of in this discussion together, and we're making the questions that we can ask. It's really about the quality of the question. We're all making the questions we can ask better.
What would you say the hottest debate is in neuroscience and meditation today?
Ooh, a hot debate. Let's see. So the contemplative neuroscience community is like really nice. So everyone is.
Well, that shocker.
Yeah.
A bunch of meditators studying meditation are actually nice. That's cool.
I know, it's crazy. But I think, like, let's see, what are some of the interesting conversations that are going on? I alluded to one earlier, which is what are the biological changes that are occurring across these different techniques, and are they the same or different? And we're right on the edge of being able to study that. Like, I just can't even like quite emphasize enough how hard it was to do meditation research until like a couple of years ago. Like, you really had to be very good, like politically, and at writing grants, and at several other things to be able to study this, because it was sort of viewed as like hippie nonsense by academia. And so we're just at the beginning of people being able to like do PhDs in this and really start research programs. And a bunch of different universities are now like investing in contemplative neuroscience in a really big way. So that question of like, is it a gradual change? Is it a punctuated equilibrium? What are the differences in brains of meditators and non-meditators? What can we measure? What can we not measure? And then something that's of great personal interest to me is the relationship between these transient kind of peak states that are available via psychedelics, and then these more stable, like abiding states or ways of being that become available with a daily, like serious meditation practice. I often wonder what it would be like. You know, I've been meditating for 20 years, and I often wish that I could sort of teleport back into my brain from 20 years ago, because
Totally.
and I think if I could take that version of myself from 20 years ago and teleport her into my experience right now, I think she might experience that teleportation as like, oh, I'm on drugs. There's a level of sort of peace and calmness and clarity and spaciousness in my experience now, all the time that I've cultivated through meditation, that I think to my younger self might just feel like I had taken some sort of substance. And so like, what's going on there? You know, how can we measure that? I think
Yeah.
that's very interesting to the community. It's certainly interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to the community at large.
I totally agree with you on that statement and feel the same.
Yeah,
I'm like, because a lot of times, let's be real, like a lot of times the meditation journey you can feel like you hit plateaus.
sure.
And part of that is just because, again, it's like you can't see the depth and change in experience on a day-to-day basis. It's very hard.
Yes.
When you do, regardless of the peak, when you don't have the peak experiences. What about there's like that product, like the Muse headset,
Sure.
that's kind of a more I guess you would call it consumer type product. Is that something that's trying to indicate to people like how their practice is going, whether it's improving?
Yeah. So like, how do you know how your practice is going, especially if you don't have a teacher? So this is one thing that I'm still advocating for, the sort of squishy meat space solution of just getting a teacher and getting a community.
Totally.
Uh, I
Totally.
just can't even tell you, like, I practiced alone for 15 years, and then I got a teacher and a community at the same time. And not only did my practice get better, but the sort of rubber meets the road of like how my practice was influencing my life got so much better once I started having people to talk to about it. So that's just like, even like as a neuroscientist, I recommend having just a community of humans to practice with. And I think that's going to become more and more important because we're entering a phase where sort of AI augmented meditation instruction and neural augmented meditation training is going to become more and more of a thing. You know, I'm working with a company called Journey, JH, that's using brain data to try to help get people into the jhanas. And right now they're doing it all person to person. So they're like just starting their first trial where they're going to take total novices and try to coach them into jhanas using their own brain activity. And I think
Hmm.
these approaches that have a human component and a community component, and then are using the brain data as another stream of information to augment the extant human to human connections, I think those are the things that are going to do really well. My opinion on this has changed over time. So, when was it? Like 5 years ago, I was starting to work on something that basically was like the goal was to have like the enlightenment helmet, and you just like put this on and you sit in your living room and you like zap
That
yourself
sounds pretty sweet.
into awakening. Yeah. And you know, it's an interesting idea, but I'm starting to think that there's a quote, I forget who said it, but when you try, I think it was John Muir, when you try to pull on one thing, you find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And
Yes.
I think there is something about the community of practice, the other people who are on the same path, even if they're doing different techniques, and having these relationships where you have teachers and mentors around you. And then as you advance on the path, you start teaching and mentoring those who come after you, and you have your peers, and you have, you've got your brain data, you've got your phenomenological like surveys, and so you're adding that as a stream, but not to replace the human to human stuff. I think that is the recipe for awakening. That is the thing that I
Mm.
want to be a part of. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. And I'd also comment that, and you see this with psychedelics, like you can have these peak experiences, and I guess maybe the enlightened helmet is intended to just keep you there, but they can be incredibly ungrounding.
Yes.
And so, like, and that can really be tremendously difficult for navigating after that. And so, for one, we talked a little bit about the Kundalini stuff before, and like, I just can't emphasize enough, like having a kind of more gradual supported path versus like climbing Everest for having never climbed a mountain before on your first mountain climbing trip, like there's a lot of merit to that. There's a lot of beauty and positive things about taking a gradual, natural path.
And even if you're gonna if you're gonna run naked up Everest, find a couple other people who are that same personality type to do it with you. Like, sure, if that's your thing,
Totally.
but just have some other people around, because there's only so ungrounded you can get with a group of other people who are at least like practicing in a similar way. And having people around who are like I said, sort of further along, for lack of a better way to put it, and who are more junior, and who are your peers, and who are going to just keep you connected to consensus reality. Like, you can have some real like out there kind of peak type experiences via psychedelics or via like high dose meditation, or even sometimes people just walking around in the world like flip into a non-dual state, and then those people end up hopefully finding a community, but sometimes running into trouble or thinking they're Jesus or something. And if you have other people around who are practicing, you end up just there's a saying like rocks in a tumbler, the monks polish one another, and having that community connection just goes a really long way.
What would you recommend? I imagine there's some people that are listening to this that are like, well, that sounds freaking great. But none of my friends are into this. What would you recommend to find a community if you don't have one?
Yeah, find your local meditation center. If you're in like a city, there will be a local meditation center. I mean, if you're in Berkeley, come to the Alembic. If you're in basically any city, if you look up, your city name and meditation center, you could try a couple of things that seem interesting to you. So almost every city has a Zen center. Almost every city has an insight center. There are typically Vajrayana centers also in most cities. They can be a little less legible, so you may have to like bounce off a couple before you find your thing. But in a lot of major cities, there are centers that have usually a weekly like open sit that you can just drop in and just talk to people. You may have to go to a couple of different places to find the thing that's right for you. This is the problem that we're trying to solve here at Alembic, where you have a whole bunch of different traditions and techniques in one place so people can try a bunch of things like right here.
That's cool.
If you're not near a city, it can be a little harder, but there are some very good online communities. So, Alembic has a YouTube channel. Michael Taft, who teaches here on Thursdays, has a Discord. And so if you watch his YouTube streams, you can join the Discord. There's like 1,500 people in there talking about practice literally every day. And people just kind of like type it. They're like, oh, this weird thing happened last night while I was meditating. Like, what is this? Or someone the other day was like, I want to learn more about cessations. And I was like, oh, you are in the right place, my friend. There's also Evolving Ground, which is a Vajrayana online community. So if you're into the sort of deeper end of practice, that's like Evolving Ground is a good place to go. And be willing to hold out for a community that feels homey for you. You want to have I remember when I found my first Sangha in San Francisco, 3 weeks in, I was like, oh, the people here are happy to see me. I'm happy to see them. And I can talk about like what's going on in my meditation practice, and they understand what I'm talking about. So don't settle, because the territory, when it's going well, you want people to share that with. And sometimes it gets weird and you want people to share that with too. So look for that sense within yourself of like, you've found a community, you've found your home.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. One question I have is, so much of my own evolution, I would characterize as something that happens off the cushion.
Yeah.
Thinking about concepts like karma yoga, where you're kind of using the events of life to become aware of what's happening in the subconscious and different things that me may revisit during meditation. How, if at all, does science, which by the way, I think can have profound impacts on the way that consciousness interprets reality, or whatever you want to call this.
Mm-hmm.
So like, how do you take into account those type of experiences that are kind of outside the realm of direct practice, but are seemingly can be foundational and fundamental in our awareness?
Absolutely. I mean, there's one view actually that the distinction between practice and life is something that starts to drop away, and it's all
Totally.
just experience, right? And
Totally.
there's this text that we're going through right now on Tuesday nights called the Lojong slogans, and one of the Lojong slogans is like turn any difficulty onto the path of awakening. And so it's like basically any experience that you're having in any instant, particularly if it's one that is like not tasty, you know, and like not one that you would prefer, like that's it. That's the path. So at some point, that distinction between the on cushion practice and the off cushion practice becomes less and less, like it gets blurry, and then it can kind of drop out. And what you're doing is, you know, with practice, one of the things we're doing is we're just changing our relationship with experience. You know,
Mm.
typically, the sort of default way that we experience things is things make us feel good or not. And the things that make us feel good, we want more of. And the things that make us not feel good, we want to push away. And then other stuff, we just ignore it. And we just walk around doing that all the time. It's exhausting. And so the on cushion practice is retraining us to say, okay, this, okay, this, okay, this, with whatever is arising. And for a while, there's that cliche of like the monk who goes up and meditates for like 10 years and then is driving down from the monastery and gets cut off in traffic and like gets super angry, you know?
Yep. Yep.
And for a while, that's kind of what we're doing. We're on the cushion. We're like, yes, like, okay, this is great. And then as soon as we go out into the world, we just like lose it totally. Um, but over time, a little bit of that acceptance that we're cultivating on the cushion starts to just show up in life. And you can accelerate that process by really holding that frame, you know, like leaving your morning practice with the intention of, okay, today is about like accepting everything, or today is about leaning into difficulty, or today is about gratitude for experience. And you can sort of like accelerate that view by putting on those lenses on purpose. But at some point it just happens. Like if you practice enough, it's just going to happen where your practice is just going to sort of expand out into your life, and you're not going to have a choice about it at some point. Yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, the word is we're talking about is practice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you just take that in a literal sense, it's like you are practicing a way of being for all times. And I've definitely had my own experiences. I remember there was this book that someone told me to read called The Greatest Salesman in the World. I don't know. Maybe this is something that happens when you work in tech startups. People to tell you to read books like that. But there was a discrete moment of the book. It's kind of about this kind of almost like The Alchemist, where this person goes on this journey and meets teachers. And there was a meditator that he met, and he goes, well, when do you meditate? And he goes, I'm always meditating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there's a point in my experience where I actually I didn't understand what that meant. And then there was a point in my experience where I did.
It keeps going. I've said that like I think like 7 times at this point.
Oh
Like,
yeah.
yeah, it
Totally.
feels like it's like once a year I'm like, oh, I thought they weren't different, but now they're really not different. And then that happens like every year. I'm like, oh wait, no, they're really not different. It just keeps going.
Where would you say you are pushing the edge in your personal practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right now, I think, and this is probably why I just talked about acceptance so much. Right now, one of my edges is about maintaining, how to describe this? Basically, maintaining an attitude or a view of like spacious acceptance, no matter what is going on. And one of the things I've been noticing in myself recently is kind of when things are uncomfortable, I don't want to feel them. And this is just me. No one else does this.
Not like a basic human
Yeah.
fundamental thing
Yeah,
that
no,
every single
it's my
person
thing.
deals with.
But I've been able to see myself doing that at a pretty high frequency. So like, I'll notice that there's like a little bit of tension that arises, and then I don't want to feel the tension, and it gets bigger, and then I like get frowny, and so I can sort of watch that happening. And one of the edges that I've been kind of exploring is how fully can I be wait, can I swear on this podcast?
Oh, please. I think I've
Okay.
said the F word 5 times.
How much of a fuck yes can I be to everything that's going on?
Mm.
Um and I don't mean by that like, oh, how much of a doormat can I be and just passively accept what's going on, but how much can I just turn towards experience, even if that's the experience of like changing what's happening right now. How much can I do that with like a full attitude of like acceptance and gratitude for experience itself? Yeah.
That's
It's
beautiful.
going okay.
That's beautiful. Well, that's why they call it practice, right? And I actually think it's an important point with this is that for me, one big concept was you have this like continuum, right? Where with the entirety of the consciousness experience, where there's usually like an exposure, which could be experiencing acceptance for a moment and feeling, whoa, I can do that. And then there's like embodiment where you're like, okay, this is just the way I am. And there's like this continuum that you go on where the duration increases, the ease increases, but it just takes time.
And then the depth also keeps increasing. Like there's a way in which a lot of these things I think are cycles, where it's like, oh, I did this before, but now I'm going through it again, but it feels much deeper, much more integrated. And I think there's a way in which, we all start meditating for different reasons. And, I wanted to suffer less. And I had a very simple goal. And a lot of people are starting now for increased well being. And you certainly have that. But as just speaking personally, I've basically fallen in love with practice. And now it feels like
Same.
it's almost this like, it's a combination of like a love affair and an artistic expression, and the practice becomes the goal at some point also, where it's just you're practicing because you practice for just the joy of it and the artistry of it. But
Yeah.
also like the deepening comfort with myself and like joy and experience and increased well-being, it just keeps going also, but it's something that now feels like a side effect of like the love of the practice rather than the other way around.
Yeah, it kind of starts off an obligation,
Yeah.
chore, then becomes the best part of your day. And you hear these stories of like monks like living in caves and just sitting there all day, blissed out.
Yeah.
And there comes a point where like, you know what, that I actually kind of get that.
Mm-hmm.
I actually could see the appeal in that more so prominently than I could before. And yeah, it's a beautiful journey.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful journey. I wish it for everyone.
Me too.
And I think everyone's on their own timeline.
Yeah.
But
It's been the, I mean,
it's hard not to share when you have the experience.
it's the
That's why I'm
single,
doing
like
this.
it's the great love of my life. And I agree. It is really hard not to share it with people. And I don't know, as I've gotten older, I've gotten more gentle about that. Like I used to just be like running around trying to get everyone in my life to meditate and also do psychedelics. But now it's just like, well, people come to it, like you said, in their own time. And I think there's something that Rob Burbea, who's a great meditator, he's no longer with us, but he wrote a book called Seeing That Frees, which is a good book for people who've done a lot of serious focused attention practice, who are starting to look for something a little deeper. That's a great book to read if you're kind of in that position. But he talks about listening to like your own longing. And that's something that I've gotten in touch with in my practice, is like a deeper level of like intuition and like, where do I want to go now? And I think without that little initial spark, that's drawing you to practice. And by the way, just I just, for the listeners, if you've listened to this far through, you have that. And so with that little spark, you can follow that all the way. But I've learned that I don't want to go out in the world and kind of bludgeon people into, you've got to meditate, because that's just not going to work. You sort of need that electricity in you that's going to resonate with the practice.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's a phase of experience where you want to go save the world.
Yeah.
And part of that is, to me, it kind of goes hand in hand with the recognition of acceptance of what is as is, and
Yes.
eventually seeing things increasingly more as perfect, which is also part of the opening of the heart and loving yourself and identity shifts. And so, yeah, I think we all go through that.
Yes, exactly.
And that's, again, why having a group is so helpful,
Yeah.
because you can kind of, encounter these phase shifts with other people going through it.
Yeah, totally.
Well, Katie, this has been, speaking of an electric conversation. So enjoyed learning about all your fantastic work and ideas and experiences. I know there's probably some people that want to just keep tabs on what you're up to, everything going on at Berkeley Alembic, the research. What's the best way to do that?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks, Scott. This has been super fun. It feels like we could just talk about this for hours and hours. So,
Totally.
beginning of a much longer conversation. I hope it's been great. And yeah, to keep up with Alembic, our website is berkeleyAlembic.org, ALEMBIC. And we send out a weekly newsletter. It has our classes that are going on that week, but it's also written by Sasha Chapin, who's a fantastic writer. So we have people who are non-local who are subscribed to the newsletter just to read it.
Does he go to the Alembic?
Yeah.
I just follow his blog.
Yeah, he's
Cool.
he's around, and he's helping with some of the Alembic Labs stuff. Part of what we want to do in the
Cool.
lab is we want to have research and communication happening like in parallel. And so I'm kind of holding down the research, and Sasha's holding down the communication side of it. So he writes the newsletter, so you can subscribe to the newsletter. We're also Berkeley Alembic everywhere, including on Twitter. I write the tweets, so you can follow us on Twitter too. And come visit us, come meditate when you're in town.
Now that's a call to action. Well, thank you everybody for listening today. This has been a really fun time together. We're grateful for you. And thanks again, Katie. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Scott. This was great fun. Talk soon, I hope.